Welcome. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Amy Sam. I am the Health Education Project Specialist at the Maxwell and Eleanor Blum Patient Family Learning Center at Mass General. Today's program is part of our Climate Change and Health series, a special collaboration between the Blum Center, the MGH Center for the Environment and Health, and the MGH Institute of Health Professions Center for Climate Change, Climate Justice, and Health. Before we get started, I want to go over a few items with you all. Please note that today's session is being recorded for educational purposes. If you're interested in viewing the recording, it'll be made available on the Blum Center website at massgeneral.org/Blum-Center. Please note that you're listen-only mode. Everyone has music, so you can hear a guest speaker today. If you have any questions for our guest speaker, you may use the chat feature, which is located at the bottom of your screen. We'll have time for in the end. Only Blum Center staff and our guest speaker will see your questions. Please do not share any personal medical information or questions in the chat. If you have a personal medical question, please ask your doctor. Lastly, at the end of today's session, you'll be directed to a brief survey, which we'd like to ask you to help us complete. Your feedback is important to us as we plan future programs. Okay, so next I'm going to introduce you all to today's guest speaker. Joining us today, we have Dr. Suellen Breakey. Dr. Breakey is a distinguished teaching associate professor in the School of Nursing and an associate director of the Center for Climate Change, Climate Justice, and Health at the MGH Institute of Health Professions in Charlestown. Her clinical background includes global health and critical care nursing. Dr. Breakey teaches in the Doctor of Nursing practice and accelerated BSN programs with a focus on ethics, evidence-based practice, and population health. She joins us today to give a talk on climate change challenges in 2024 and beyond. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Breakey.
Thank you, Amy, and good afternoon, everybody. I'm just going to share my screen. Can you see that? Okay, great. And let me just put it into slideshow. Okay. All right. Well, as I said, welcome and thanks for joining us today on this actually lovely, beautiful day, I will say. And so what I'm going to do today is just kind of run through some of the issues we're facing in terms of climate change and specifically talk about how that's impacting health and well-being. So climate change has been identified as an urgent public health and health equity issue, and probably the most urgent of the 21st century. Globally, 3.6 million people living in areas that are susceptible to climate impacts. There's anticipated to be 250,000 more deaths as expected between 2030 and 2050. And developing countries and regions, even within our own country, that have poor infrastructure are the least resilient to these climate impacts and therefore more susceptible to health risk. Every year there is the Conference of the Parties. Last year was COP28, where people got together in Dubai, I believe it was. And for the first time during COP28, during these Conference of the Parties, where they come together and talk about climate change, ways to decrease greenhouse gas emissions, clean energy, etc. Last year was the first time that they actually had an inaugural health theme day, which was a big step in the right direction, because what it means is that people are understanding that we have to center health when we talk about climate change because it's impacting us significantly. And so they had a declaration of health and climate, which was endorsed by 143 countries. And they have a dedicated health target, but they have not yet quantified the target with indicators, but it really, focuses on creating, resilience against climate change, health-related impacts, and also creating climate resilient health services, because we know that, kind of the catch-22 or the irony is that the health sector itself is a major contributor to greenhouse gas emissions, and if it were a country, it would be the 5th leading contributor. So what's happening in the United States specifically? Every year, the Lancet puts out a, it's called the Lancet Countdown on Climate Change and Health, and they have been doing this since the mid teens. I want to say 2014. I could be wrong about that. But they have been they've been measuring indicators, health indicators. And then what happens is the United States has a team that reads the Lancet report and creates the US policy brief for the United States. And that happens every year. And so, and it usually happens around the end of the year. And so this information, these are just a couple of snippets from the 2023 policy brief. Summer 23 was the hottest on record. We'll have to see what happens this summer because we've already had a heat wave in Massachusetts, and certainly, you know, a heat dome that's impacted a large swath of the United States. Last summer, Maricopa County had approximately 425 heat-related deaths, and that number is probably very significantly underestimated because oftentimes mortality related to heat is seen through other means, for instance, cardiac or respiratory deaths. So it's sometimes that's hard to flesh out. We've had severe drought in southern and midwestern United States. The Lahaina fire in Hawaii last year, which devastated that area. Unprecedented rainfall we've seen. And malaria and dengue, which are not endemic to the United States, have been seen. Malaria in Arkansas for the first time since it was eradicated, Texas, Maryland, and Florida, and dengue in Arizona, California, Florida, and Texas. And so the numbers are small, but it's just indicating that with the warming of the planet and also, you know, the increased precipitation, that this creates an environment that is ripe for these vector-borne illnesses. And so they're expanding into different geographical locations. Actually, I want to go back to this slide because in the middle here, this is a slide looking at the US exposure to wildfire smoke. And you can see in 2023, there was a sharp uptick. And we know, again, we have been experiencing more wildfires. Last summer, I had one. I live in Wakefield, Massachusetts. We had one at a local, it's called Breakheart Reservation, which was very unusual, and it took several days to, you know, get that fire out. So we're seeing, again, in different geographical locations, there's some expansion of these problems. And of course, wildfire smoke is very unhealthy to breathe in, and we've all experienced that. So, you know, this is just to show you, I'm sure you're all familiar, but, you know, why the increase in greenhouse gas emissions impacts the warming of the planet. And it's because the sunlight just kind of absorbs these greenhouse gases, and they just sit in the atmosphere because the number of greenhouse gases is disproportionate. And so this is what happens. And then the warmth then kind of radiates back down on the earth into the oceans, into the land, etc. This was from 5/29. This is from the NASA website. You can go on and you can see what our current level of carbon dioxide is, excuse me. And you can see that for a long, long time, there was natural variation in carbon dioxide levels. And then around 1950, or maybe a little bit before then, where there was, you know, the advent of the Industrial Revolution, you can see this sharp spike. And we had a little bit of a dip during COVID, but that is back up to a fairly high level. This is just to show where we're, you know, in the United States, where we're emitting our greenhouse gas emissions. And so most of it, the majority of it is carbon dioxide, but you can see methane, nitrous oxide, and other fluorocarbons are also important and significant because they actually last longer in the atmosphere. So they, while they may contribute less, they contribute significantly to warming because of their longevity in the atmosphere. And as I mentioned, the healthcare sector itself, both globally but also within countries, is a huge emitter. And it mirrors pretty much, you know, what we all in society, kind of the same ratio of emissions, the largest being electricity, gas, heat and cooling, as you can see here at 40%. This slide just shows you that when we think about what happens in the healthcare setting, these are described as scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 emissions. And so scope 1 are the direct emissions that come from the healthcare system itself. You know, in terms of facilities, vehicles, etc. And then you have scope 2 emissions, which are indirect, and some of these come from the things that we in the healthcare sector purchase to run our buildings. And then there are also indirect, you can see here, lots of different indirect ways which we contribute to green, which the healthcare sector contributes through. And one that has been kind of something that people have taken an interest in has been how healthcare systems have invested their own money. Another is commuting or business travel. You know, the use of planes, trains to go to conferences, etc. That's been something that people have looked at. And of course, that came to light during COVID when a lot of conferences went virtual, but many have gone back to being in person. And certainly there's some benefit to that, but there's also, we have to be knowledgeable about some of these ways in which the healthcare sector is contributing. And certainly supplies as well. In terms of losses, economic losses, and reported deaths, you can see here, this slide just shows you kind of per climate impact, what the impact has been on reported deaths and also economic losses. And so you can see in terms of economic losses, storms have really, you know, been significant over these past decades. And in terms of deaths, you can see drought has been a huge contributor as well. And, you know, this is a very busy slide, but the point of it is to show that if you take a look globally at greenhouse gas emissions, you can see on the second kind of wheel that the top 10 emitters are responsible for, you know, somewhere around 67 to 70% of all emissions. So that includes China, the US, the EU, India, Russia, Japan, Brazil, and Indonesia. These become a little bit less, as you can see, with China being the biggest emitter and the United States being the second top emitter. But this notion of climate justice is that the people who contribute least to greenhouse gas emissions are disproportionately negatively impacted, and most likely because, you know, these are less wealthy countries with less resilient infrastructure, and so they're hit the hardest. This, this kind of shows you there's a term called syndemic, which I'm not sure if you people are familiar with this term, but it's essentially syndemics are, and they've been identified in different ways, but the one I wanted to point out here is the syndemic of climate change, structural racism, and economic injustice, and how that has created, disproportionate number of poor health outcomes and premature death for people who are impacted by this syndemic. And this came out of the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine. But a syndemic is something that can, essentially the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. And so each one of these epidemics mutually enhances the negative effects of the other. And so taken together, it has more of a negative impact on human health and well-being. And we mentioned climate justice, and again, even within our own, United States, within cities or rural areas, people who contribute least to greenhouse gas emissions are disproportionately impacted, again, because of their weakened infrastructure. They have more damage, and then they have less ability to adapt and become resilient, both at the individual and community levels. So some of the things that structural racism and environmental justice issues have created have also been born out of historical redlining, where historically marginalized communities are still impacted, even though that practice, ended in 1968. These communities suffered from economic disinvestment, weakened infrastructure, disproportionate exposure to land and air pollution, and a lack of access to quality health care. And so this all kind of, just creates more of a burden on these both historically marginalized communities, both certain communities of color and low socioeconomic communities. And so something that we need to take into account when we're thinking about health impacts and also strategies to mitigate those health impacts. This is just an infographic to show you the myriad ways in which climate change impacts health. And so if you look, as I just kind of mentioned, you have infrastructure and you have water systems, energy systems, food systems, health systems, people in their communities. And so depending on where you live, you have different exposures to climate impacts or hazards, which include extreme weather, heat, sea level rise, air pollution, vector distribution and ecology, water scarcity, and reduced food production. And so there are some areas where food can no longer be, people cannot grow their own food in certain communities or places because of sea level rise, but also the food itself is becoming less nutritious because what's happening is the nutritional components of the food, the minerals and whatnot, vitamins and minerals are changing because of changes in growth patterns because of warming and CO2 production. And so the health outcomes here include injury and death from extreme weather events, heat-related illness, which is preventable, but it's a major cause of morbidity and mortality, respiratory illness from, poor air quality and heat, wildfire smoke, waterborne diseases, zoonoses, vector-borne diseases, malnutrition, from this decrease in food system infrastructure, non-communicable diseases, and mental and psychosocial health, which is really something that is being looked at and talked about more. This is just a little mnemonic for thinking about how climate change is impacting health. So with the mnemonic is heat wave. So heat illness, exacerbation of heart and lung conditions, asthma, traumatic injury, water, foodborne illness, allergies, vector and insects, emotional stress. So this doesn't really capture everything. Another big area, a group of people that are being impacted are pregnant people and newborns. These are terms that we talk about. Mitigation, when we're thinking about climate change strategies, is reducing or stabilizing greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere. Adaptation is decreasing our vulnerability to the impacts of climate change. Resilience is being able to really plan and absorb and recover from adverse events. And of note is there certainly are some health co-benefits of addressing climate change impacts. You know, walking or riding a bike instead of driving is one example. So the people who are at risk and who continue to be at risk include the very young and the very old, women and pregnant women, children, socioeconomically disadvantaged, indigenous peoples, communities of color, people living with disabilities, people who are housing insecure or homeless, and those living with chronic physical and mental illness. So that's a lot of people to consider when we think about climate change impacts and how that's impacting health. And so the goal then is to really increase adaptive ability so that both individual and community resilience can be strengthened. And when you can do that, then you can lift up the people who are most at risk. So in terms of heat, I think we're all getting a lot more educated about the impact of heat. Even just in the news very recently, there was a number of deaths in people who had gone to make the pilgrimage to Mecca because of the high heat and lack of, appropriate protections. There was a lot of people, sadly died. So these events are happening more and more frequently. But the urban heat island profile, I'm not sure if people are familiar with this, but essentially it's hotter in areas that, particularly urban areas where there's a lack of green space, a lack of tree cover, there's more impervious surfaces like asphalt. And so what happens is those, because there's less green space, shade, grass, which can absorb the heat and or kind of deflect the heat and protect us and cool the area down. In these places where there's more, impervious spaces, the heat just gets absorbed into that. And at night, what happens is it never cools to the level that it does where people do have shade. And so people who live in these spaces in urban heat islands never really get any reprieve from that high heat. And so it can be, much hotter in these areas. And so they don't get that reprieve. The other thing about these areas is, oftentimes there's a lot of air conditioning, which is releasing heat into the air. So it's a necessary evil, but it's also contributing to the urban heat island effect. And so when when we think about people, it's important to think about where do people live, because, if they live in these areas, are they taking the right precautions? Do people know what they need to do? Do they have access to cooling centers? Do they have access to air conditioning? Or in some cases, fans? Do they have shades on their windows? So all kinds of ways that we can prevent heat-related illness. And I think one thing is just really increasing awareness. This is just showing the heat index, which, the story here is really, it's not just the heat, it's the humidity. And so when you add relative humidity and temperature, then what that does to the body is it says it feels actually hotter. So you can live in a dry, hot place. So let's say the relative humidity is 40% and it's 94 or 92. It might feel, very close to that. But when you add relative humidity, which we're seeing more of in this area, I would say as well. Let's say you have an 80% day, 80% relative relative humidity and it's a 90% day, to your body, it feels like 113. And so it's really important to consider that because it can be dangerous. The combination can increase danger related to illnesses from heat-related conditions. This is a tool that my colleagues and I put together that we've been using. We've actually been using this out in the community. We have nursing students who are going out in the community on a van, a mobile van, and they've been actually using this tool with people to help people understand what their own personal risk factors for heat-related illness is, and then kind of using that to talk about ways that they can prevent it. But people who live in urban heat islands, as I mentioned, occupational workers, people who work outside in the heat or who work inside in like manufacturing, where it can also be very warm. People who have lack of access to shade, people who are unable to take breaks. And so really occupational health workers are at risk, is particularly those who don't understand their rights or whose rights are not being respected. So people to consider would be migrant farm workers, for instance, who may have a certain level of vulnerability about advocating for themselves. People with pre-existing conditions I mentioned, cognitive, sensory, physical disability, certain medications can actually increase your risk for heat-related illness. And so it's important to, I would say if you're going to go see your healthcare provider, you have your visit, your yearly visit, that's something to talk with them about and to find out, are there things that particularly that you may be unaware of that puts you at risk. Some of these things I think you can identify yourself, but particularly medications is something to kind of have a good understanding about. This is from the Lancet US Brief. In 2022, because this came out in 2023, adults older than 65 were exposed to 2.8% more heat wave days per year compared to the baseline, which is 1986 to 2005. Heat-related mortality, for older persons has almost doubled in the last 20 years. And again, remember I said it's preventable. And infants under 1 year were exposed to an additional 3.2 heat wave days. And so that's, they're very at risk, particularly because they have small body surface areas, and both older adults and kids. Well, older adults aren't always aware of their thirst because that sensation leaves as you get older. And of course, children under the age of 1 can have difficulty regulating their temperature as well. So just some numbers about occupational exposure. In 2019, 2 billion potential hours of labor were lost due to extreme heat. And these were the industries you can see that were impacted. And also in 2022, that number rose to 2.9 billion hours of labor, and 43% were in construction, 33% in services, manufacturing, agriculture. So there's a huge economic potential there. In terms of extreme weather events, we know that these are some oldies, but goodies here, hurricanes. And we know there have been many more. And there's also been a cold weather event, Superstorm Uri, which happened a few years ago, which also impacted people pretty significantly and also impacted the infrastructure, if you remember. But I did end here with Maria. I kind of stopped cataloging these, but at the time of Hurricane Maria, the reported death rate was 81 fatalities. And what's interesting about that, and so if you look at what extreme weather events can lead to, not only can it lead to death, heat exhaustion and heat stroke, because when people lose their access to air conditioning and it's really hot, then that puts them at risk. hypothermia and frostbite, trauma-related injury, and included there is interpersonal violence, intimate partner violence and child maltreatment, new onset of illnesses, mental health impacts, and exacerbation of chronic illnesses because of the loss of health care or lack of access to medications. And in fact, after Hurricane Maria, a group of researchers went to Puerto Rico and they actually, with boots on the ground, they actually went out to these areas that were really hard hit, very rural areas. And they did community surveys and they found that the rate was probably closer to like 4,700 deaths. And that is because not only did people die from, trauma-related injuries, but also because of delayed or interrupted health care and lack of access to critical services. So things, for instance, like, dialysis is just one example. And so, again, it's just important to note that sometimes these numbers get underestimated, but these things really impact health. They have a significant impact. Air pollution is another biggie, attributed to 6.4 million deaths worldwide in 2015. And not only from ambient air pollution, but also from household air pollution. So things like the way we cook, and these are global numbers. So for instance, there are countries that use indoor wood or coal, open fires. And so this can impact people as well. There's been a lot of talk within our communities around gas stoves. And that does increase, indoor air pollution. So people who have asthma or who have certain chronic conditions should understand their risk and ways to mitigate that risk again. It's also noted that air pollution is an underappreciated cause of non-communicable diseases like heart attack and stroke, for example. So some of the impacts, it can impact fetal lung development, increased and more severe respiratory disease, increases in asthma prevalence and severity, lung cancer. I mentioned cardiovascular disease and stroke, ischemic heart diseases, and most likely related to neurodegenerative disorders in adults like Parkinson's or neurodevelopmental disorders in kids like ADHD. I think the evidence for that is a little less clear. And as I mentioned before, poor pregnancy outcomes because the air pollution can actually get cross into the fetus through the placenta. They have found black soot in placenta, and that's probably the reason why also fetal lung development is impacted. So I just wanted to show you there are 5 major pollutants: ground level ozone, which is different from, atmospheric ozone, particle pollution or particulate matter, carbon monoxide, sulfur dioxide, nitrogen dioxide. And this site, Air Now, if you're not familiar with it, I know that we can all check our air quality on our phones, but if you go to airnow.gov, you also get a real-time reading of what the air quality is like. You can put in your address, your street, your zip code. But the airnow.gov site also has a lot of really good resources for people who are more impacted by poor air quality, people with asthma, for instance. And it has strategies to how you can protect yourself during times when the air quality is poor. And so it's a great site with lots of information. And this is just to show you, I just like this slide because PM 2.5, that means that these particulate matter are smaller than 2.5 microns. So they can only be seen under an electron microscope. And this is comparing that to PM10, which is like pollen, dust, mold, and then a human hair, which is 50 to 70 microns, and then a piece of beach sand. So you can see that these 2.5 PM 2.5, they're very, very small. They can get into your system, and they can cause lots of inflammation and other bad things that impact our health. And then ground level ozone is the combination of heat, sunlight, and then volatile chemicals that are in the air and compounds. And so together, that causes what we would kind of consider smog. And on a hot, muggy day, sometimes you can see that smog and you feel that heaviness in your breathing. And so, when we feel that, but even at lower levels of ground level ozone or PM 2.5, those people who are at risk, incur more risk. And then this is also, climate change has also been related to the climate migration conflict nexus globally. So there are places in the world where people, because of drought, for instance, Syria is an example, where farmers had to move into the city because they could no longer farm the land, for instance, or it was no longer habitable. They move into the city, you have more people, there's more ability for conflict. And even in this country, we have climate migration in and of itself, even if we take the conflict piece away, is increasing as people move to cooler areas, or people are moving to areas with to avoid sea level rise. And so this really has an impact on this can cause, especially for children, when people migrate to different areas, they might be separated from their families. It puts them at risk for things like human trafficking, potentially abuse, cognitive delays, if they, interruptions in learning, if they aren't going to school during this time, mental health issues, post-traumatic stress, anxiety, depression. So something to consider, we'll need to consider as, we're seeing an uptick in climate migrants, not only internationally, but nationally as well. This infographic just kind of shows you the impacts that heat exposure and as I mentioned before, also the heat and air pollution together can impact on pregnancy outcomes. So increase in stillbirths, genetic defects, congenital defects, preterm birth, stillbirth, because of the impact of heat and cooling. So physiologically, the impact on blood flow and blood supply and cooling, and then the impacts from air pollution and the particulate matter that can get into the fetal blood supply. So vector-borne diseases, again, I think we all know we're seeing more ticks, we're seeing, more mosquitoes, with increased precipitation and extreme weather events and temperature. So things like Lyme disease are becoming more prevalent, and not only in humans, but pets as well, something to think about for our pets. And as I mentioned, things are traveling and expanding to different geographical areas like dengue and malaria that we haven't previously seen. This is just looking at Lyme disease, and you can see the top left is 2001 to 2014 to 2018 to 2022. And you can see that there's been a significant expansion of Lyme disease, but also the concentration of it, the prevalence of it in these geographical areas is also increasing. So, this has ramifications for, how we protect ourselves when we're outside in terms of protective clothing, bug spray, all of these things we have to be really kind of acutely aware of how we can prevent these things from happening to us. And then, as I mentioned, mental health and well-being is another area that's getting a lot of recognition. And there's a term called solastalgia, which is a sense of a loss of relationship to a place that's important. And so when people are forced to migrate or leave the land where they, or their houses where they live, and uproot, this can cause this occurrence of solastalgia. And indigenous populations are particularly susceptible to this because of their relationship and their connection to the land. And as they need to move away from that land, that really puts them at risk for mental health impacts. Eco-anxiety is another term, which is just, kind of, we're watching this and we're seeing it more and more on the news. And what is that doing to us? It's creating a level of anxiety that we have, but watching kind of like the degradation of the environment, in front of our own eyes, and worrying about our own future, but also the future generations. I talked a little bit about malnutrition. One of the things that, I mentioned this term syndemic, and this is another syndemic that's been identified, which is climate change, obesity, and undernutrition. So there are places where people don't have access to healthy and nutritious food, and so the food has to be shipped in. So the Marshall Islands is an example because they have had a lot of sea level rise, and so a lot of the food that gets shipped in is unhealthy food, processed food. So this is leading to undernutrition, but in the face of obesity, which is creating, more non-communicable diseases like diabetes, hypertension, cardiac disease. And so it's a problem that is potentially will get worse as we see more sea level rise, or more people who are unable to grow food because of the impacts of climate change. Water-related diseases, we see this because oftentimes water processing plants and farms can be close to each other, and ironically. And so what happens is when we have a big storm, sometimes the waste from farms can run into areas and get into the water supply. And, that's one way that our food gets contaminated. With the warming of the ocean, the food supply is changing. There are certain things that are not, growing or thriving because the water temperatures are too warm. Harmful algal blooms, these are, and we're seeing more of these, even locally, we have to be worried about these. They can produce neurotoxins, and so either swimming in an area with harmful algal blooms can be dangerous, or food that has been cultivated from areas where there are these algal blooms can then contain a certain level of neurotoxin and cause issues. So lots of things that these intersections can really create issues. And I've mentioned this a number of times, but even locally, these algal blooms have killed pets that owners have let go in the water, and then unknowingly the water has been contaminated with these algal blooms, and pets have died. So something to be careful about. And then these are just some useful tools that I will, and I'll send Amy my slides. The EPA Environmental Justice Mapping Tool is a really useful tool if you want to see what in your area you might be, you should be aware of in terms of climate change impacts or environmental justice impacts. The CDC Social Vulnerability Index looks at how susceptible you can type in a location and how susceptible or vulnerable you are to disasters. And I mentioned Air Now, which is a great site with lots of good information. So this is a screenshot of the EPA EJ screen. And I happen to put in Chelsea, Mass, because we're located in Charlestown, and we have some relationships in Chelsea. And you can see, you can put in a town, and then on the left-hand side, there's all kinds of different indicators that you can look up. Environmental justice indices, pollution, socioeconomic, health disparities, climate change data, etc. And so then I had put in hazardous waste proximity, and so this is Chelsea. And you can see what happens is it lights up with those areas where it gives you a sense of where things are critical, where things are not so bad. But we know that Chelsea's an environmental justice community and does a lot of great advocating for itself. But they have been hit hard with the tankers that come in and the road salt, and they hold the region's fuel. And so this is the result of that, of these areas where they're impacted. And that's just one example. There's lots of other things you can look at. This is traffic proximity, just as another example. And then this is from the vulnerability, CDC social vulnerability. And I typed in Chelsea again, and you can see the levels: low, low, medium, high, and high. So these are just ways that you can actually learn a little bit about your community and what's impacting it. And then this is just to show that Yale has been surveying people about their thoughts and perceptions about global warming since 2013. And over the last 10 years, you can see that the numbers of people who are alarmed and concerned have increased. The number that have been dismissive has gone down a little bit. So, this is just really showing that people are starting to understand that we are being impacted. And I think that, the news has done a lot to kind of show that, because we see that just about every day on the news. And then what I included here also was just a whole bunch of resources that have to do with extreme heat and air pollution. And if you live in the Mystic Valley, a report that kind of lets you know how your areas are being impacted. Lots of ways to look at, like I said, preventative strategies from some great resources. And then I'm not sure if I put in here, I don't think I put it in here, but the other thing that, we should be thinking about is planning for and preparing, even within our own families, how we would respond, how we're going to respond to the next urgent issue. I mean, last weekend there were tornado warnings in my area, and while tornadoes haven't conclusively been shown to be a result of climate change, anecdotally they do seem to be increasing, but particularly around this area. But hurricanes, extreme weather events of any kind, it's really important to prepare. And so the mass.gov actually has a great website that, and I think every state does, as does the White House Office for Climate Change and Health Equity. There are lots of sites where they give good checklists for what you should be thinking about when you're preparing for disaster. What should be in your emergency kit, from a 2-week supply of medications to certain foods to a radio, like a battery operated radio, water, things to make sure your pets are safe, communication plan, all kinds of things to kind of consider, so that it gives you, not only does it allow you to prepare for and plan for a potential emergency, but it also gives you some agency, some way of doing something that makes you feel like you're kind of doing something to hopefully prevent bad outcomes. And I think that's one thing that we can all do, is kind of think about our individual resilience and how we can increase that either through awareness, if we have certain medical conditions. You know, for instance, if you have, you know, bad asthma and it's a day, you know, you can be checking the air quality. And if the air quality is not great, then you should be wearing an N95. Or, you know, avoiding the fireplace in your house or candles. There's a whole host of ways we can take action to optimize our health despite what's happening in the environment. So I am going to end it there. I don't know if we have time for a couple questions. I hope that was helpful.
Thank you, Dr. Breakey. We're now at the end of the session. If you have any questions, feel free to enter them in the chat. You'll also see that I shared a few of the resources that were mentioned in today's presentation. There were also resources shared towards the end, so feel free to email the Blum Center. I'll enter that in the chat right now, and we'd be happy to share that with you. So I have a question regarding with now the summer in full swing, it's warming up. I mean, even today, right now on my phone, it says it's 85 degrees, and I believe tomorrow it can reach up to 90. Do you have tips on how to stay safe during the summer months as it warms up and gets really hot?
So I think, yes. Again, one is to really understand your individual risk. So for instance, you know, if you're older, if you're on medication, like a water pill or a medicine for your blood pressure or your heart rate, or you're young and you have asthma, what you want to be able to do is know your risk and then know how to address it. So on these really hot days, you know, avoid going out when the sun's at its hottest. You know, if you're going to go out or you want to exercise, preferably you do it inside, or you go out earlier in the morning or later in the afternoon when things cool down. Drink plenty of fluids. And again, as I mentioned, so my mother, who is 91, she's good about this because, as I mentioned, as people get older, they lose their thirst sensation. And so by the time an older person is thirsty, it's too late. So drink water, make sure you stay hydrated. If you have water restrictions because of a medical issue, talk to your healthcare provider. You know, I think that's another really important thing. If you don't have access to air conditioning, know where the cooling centers are in your area. Check on your neighbors who may be socially isolated or elderly. Put the shades down. You know, there's a lot of the things we can do are they're not difficult things to do. I mean, getting access to air conditioning that in your home, that can be difficult if you don't have the financial means to either buy it or pay the bill for that. But then know if there's a cooling center. Wear light clothing. You know, there's a whole host of things, and I would say, because I'm probably missing a few, there's so many resources out there, from the CDC, like I said, from the American Heart Association, from mass.gov, Harvard Sea Change and AmeriCares has some great resources. There's just a lot out there, and I think just prepare is key.
Thank you. And you made an excellent point about climate change and how it affects one's mental health. I would like to put a plug in that we are hosting an event tomorrow at the Blum Center. It's called the Climate Cafe event. I'm going to enter that in the chat for more details. And it's just a safe space where one can kind of share any feelings, concerns that you may have around climate change. It's going to be facilitated by Dr. James McCowan. He is a licensed clinical psychologist, as well as a co-chair of the MJ Psychiatry Climate Change and Mental Health Committee. He'll be facilitating that tomorrow at the Blum Center. It will be in person only from 11 a.m. to 12:30 p.m. So if you're interested, we do ask you to let us know so that you can register in advance. Feel free to either let us know in the chat today, or you can also email the Blum Center to let us know if you're interested, and we hope to see you there.
Wow, that's great. That's really great.
So I believe this concludes our climate change and health series. We're going to take a little break. In the meantime, do you have any resources one can go to learn more, stay up to date on this topic and all the very important work that you're involved in?
Oh, gosh, there's so many resources. Well, I'm trying to think what a really good one would be. There's Eco America is a great resource. The Planetary Health Alliance is a great resource. For health, I'm not sure if there are any nurses on the call, but the Alliance of Nurses for Healthy Environments is a great resource. Physicians for Social Responsibility. But I would say the CDC has wonderful resources that are written for the lay public. And like I mentioned, mass.gov has some good emergency preparedness resources in particular.
I would personally love to give a special thank you to you and Dr. Patrice Nicholas. It's been a wonderful opportunity collaborating with you and our special guests on such an important topic. It's been a pleasure working with you on this climate change and health series.
Likewise, Amy, you've been great and it's been fun. So thank you.
Do you have any final thoughts you'd like to share before we end today's session?
I don't think so. Thanks for coming. My guess is that people are probably somewhat well informed about some of these things. And I think some things probably more than other, like to your point about mental health, I think that's becoming increasingly something people are thinking about, but I just will reiterate it, like, be proactive about being aware of your risks and trying to mitigate those through what can be some pretty simple strategies. And always remember to talk to your healthcare provider if you have questions, particularly around heat or air pollution that might be impacting your health or the medications that you take.
Thank you. And with that, I think we're going to end today's session. As I had mentioned, today's session is being recorded. It'll be made available on the Blum Center website at massgeneral.org/Blum-Center. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye-bye.